He thought she was just a ghost from his past until he saw the little girl with his eyes sleeping on a bench and realized the life he abandoned had kept breathing without him. He wasn't supposed to stop in that town. Just a shortcut, a broken air conditioner, a flicker of heat on the highway, and suddenly Caleb Morgan, billionaire CEO with a watch worth more than most people's houses, found himself standing under a rusted sign that read, "Willow Creek, where new beginnings bloom." He didn't believe in second chances. Not really. Not after the way he left her. Not after the way he built an empire on silence and sealed doors. But when he stepped into the dim little diner off Main Street and saw her, Grace Thompson, the woman he once walked away from without a word, his world tilted. There was no yelling, no slaps, just a nod, a flicker of recognition, and the ache of 10 years collapsing into a glance. He should have turned around. Should have gotten back in the car, called a driver, flown to Manhattan. But he didn't. Because the next morning he saw a little girl sleeping on a bench outside the public library. She had paint on her fingers, a sketchbook clutched to her chest, and eyes familiar, unflinching, that pierced something ancient in him. Her name was Sophie. She was 9 years old. And in that moment, Caleb realized something devastating and true. He hadn't just abandoned a woman. He had left behind a child. His child. And this time, he wasn't going anywhere. Caleb Morgan wasn't the kind of man who stopped for anything. Not traffic. Not people. Not even his own exhaustion. But when the air conditioning in his SUV died in the middle of a blistering southern summer, and the GPS rerouted him through the forgotten speck of Willow Creek, he had no choice but to pull over. The town didn't even look like it belonged on a map anymore. Time had peeled the paint off its buildings, rusted the signs, and drained the life out of its narrow streets. His car, a sleek black Range Rover that looked like a spaceship compared to the dusty trucks and bicycles scattered across town, hissed as he turned off the engine. For a moment, Caleb just sat there staring through the windshield, wondering how a man who'd built a billion-dollar company could find himself stranded in a place without even a visible gas station. He stepped out, adjusting the cuffs of his dress shirt, and was immediately hit by the dense humidity and the faint scent of fried grease and wildflowers. It was almost poetic in a way he didn't have time to appreciate. His phone buzzed, no signal. Of course. He looked around, his sharp blue eyes scanning the street like he was searching for a deal, not a mechanic. Across the road stood a small diner, its windows slightly fogged from the inside, a hand-painted sign above the door reading Grace's Table. The name meant nothing to him in that moment, just another folksy attempt at charm in a town built on ghosts. He crossed the street without thinking, his Italian shoes clicking against the uneven pavement, oblivious to the glances of locals peering from behind curtains and shop windows. Caleb Morgan looked like a man who didn't belong because he didn't. Everything about him radiated money and detachment, the Rolex on his wrist, the tailored slacks, the restless eyes that never stopped calculating. He pushed open the door to the diner, expecting air conditioning and silence. Instead, a tiny bell jingled overhead, the scent of warm biscuits and brewed coffee wrapped around him, and a woman behind the counter slowly looked up. For a split second, something in him paused, some cellular recognition he couldn't explain. Her eyes widened only slightly, as if she'd seen a ghost. Caleb's mouth went dry, though he didn't know why. She turned back to the coffee pot without a word, and he sat down at the nearest booth, heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with broken machinery. He had come to fix his car, but something deeper, far more broken, had just started to stir. The diner sat on the corner of Main and 2nd like it had been there forever, weathered by time, forgotten by change, and stubbornly alive in a town that seemed to have surrendered to stillness. Its once red paint had faded into a dusty rust, and the windows bore the smudges of countless hands and years, streaked with fingerprints and memories no one bothered to wipe away. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of bacon grease, burnt coffee, and something softer like old stories clinging to the wood-paneled walls. The booths were cracked vinyl patched in places with duct tape that no one even tried to match by color anymore. The ceiling fan creaked on every slow revolution, stirring the heavy summer air, just enough to feel like breath. A chalkboard menu leaned slightly to the left behind the counter, its words written in slanted cursive with half-erased specials from the week before. It wasn't charming in the way rich people called things rustic. It was simply tired and honest about it. The kind of place people returned to, not because they loved it, but because it never left them. It was there when someone's father died, or when the factory laid off 20 men in a day. It was where the sheriff took his lunch, and where old widows refilled their coffee twice just to stay a little longer. The town outside matched the diner's quiet decay wooden porches with peeling paint stores that closed before sunset and children who walked home slow because there was nothing urgent waiting for them. The beauty of it wasn't in aesthetics, it was in endurance. This place had survived long enough for time to stop being cruel and start being familiar. When Caleb Morgan stepped through the diner's door, he brought with him the smell of leather and asphalt, the sharpness of another world, a world that operated in quarterly earnings and performance charts. He didn't belong here, and the room felt it. Conversations dropped to murmurs, eyes flicked toward him and then away. He stood out not just in wealth, but in posture, in pace, in the way he scanned the room like it owed him answers. Yet even as he tried to stay detached, something about the place reached inside him and pressed a bruise he'd long buried. This wasn't just any small-town diner. This was her diner. He didn't know it yet, not fully, but the walls did. The smell did. And somewhere behind that faded counter, so did she. When Caleb stepped into the diner, the door gave a tired creak behind him, and the tiny bell above it rang with a soft metallic chime that seemed to echo longer than it should have, as if the room itself were pausing to register his presence. The lighting inside was dim, but not cold, more worn than unfriendly, like a room that had grown old in the absence of people who used to laugh there. He glanced around, scanning the space with the reflexive sharpness of a man who spent decades reading boardrooms and strangers for advantage. The place was nearly empty, just one older man at the corner booth nursing a cup of coffee and flipping through a newspaper. Caleb took 2 steps toward the counter, ready to ask for a menu or a mechanic when a movement from behind the bar caught his eye. A woman stood with her back to him, tying her apron, her shoulders squared, her hair tied in a loose bun that exposed the curve of her neck. Something about that posture, its stillness, its strength, made Caleb's stomach tighten. And then she turned around. Her eyes met his, like the strike of a match in a dark room. No scream, no gasp, just stillness, sharp, paralyzing, and full of everything unsaid. Grace. The name struck through him like thunder behind his ribs. She looked different, older, yes, and thinner, but her face still held that quiet beauty he remembered. Not the polished beauty of city women he dated, but something rooted and raw like the earth after rain. Her eyes had changed most. They had once been full of dreams and fire. Now they held something heavier, a tired resilience, a history. Her lips parted slightly as if on the verge of a breath or a question or a curse, but nothing came out. She looked at him like a ghost she hadn't prepared to see, like a memory that had walked out of the past in flesh and blood. Caleb opened his mouth to speak, but words failed him, swallowed by the sudden weight in his chest. Instead, he just stood there, taking her in, drowning in all the years he had thrown away. Grace didn't shout. She didn't ask why. She simply turned away, reached for a coffee pot, and poured into a chipped mug like it was just another day, like he was just another customer. And that, more than any outburst, made Caleb feel the depth of what he had broken. Their eyes met across the space of the small diner, and for a moment neither of them moved. The seconds stretched long and thin, suspended in the air, like dust caught in sunlight. Caleb hadn't prepared for this, not for the sudden punch of recognition, not for the avalanche of emotion that followed. Grace didn't flinch, didn't smile, didn't scowl. Her expression was still unreadable, but her eyes held years of silence, years of questions, years of hurt she'd clearly learned to bury deep. In that one glance, Caleb saw everything he had once turned his back on, a love he had fled from, a future he never had the courage to face, and a woman who, despite the ache in her chest, had chosen to survive without him. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer something, an apology, a greeting, anything but. His throat closed up. The words that once came effortlessly in business meetings, in keynote speeches, in interviews across the globe, now crumbled inside him like ash. Grace held his gaze for a moment longer, then looked away, not dramatically, not with fury, just with the kind of quiet dismissal that hurt more than shouting ever could. She poured a cup of coffee with mechanical grace, her hands steady, now her posture composed. She brought it to his table and placed it down with a simple, "Here." Her voice was low even, but it echoed in his ears like a memory he'd tried too hard to forget. He whispered grace barely louder than a breath. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked back to the counter, wiping her hands on a towel that had seen too many long shifts and too many buried emotions. Caleb sat there staring at the steaming cup in front of him, wondering how the woman he had once promised the world to had become someone he no longer had the right to address. The ache in his chest wasn't from shock, it was from recognition, the devastating awareness that she had rebuilt her life piece by piece in the ruins of his absence, and now he was the outsider in a story he helped abandon. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with all the things they never said, and all the time they'd never get back. Grace moved like a woman who had trained herself not to feel. Her motions were practiced, steady, mechanical, picking up menus, wiping counters, pouring coffee without spilling a drop, all without once meeting Caleb's eyes again. She didn't ignore him, not in the obvious way that would have given her away, but in that distant, polite manner reserved for strangers. You don't plan on seeing again. Caleb watched her not openly but through side glances, and stolen seconds trying to find traces of the woman he used to know, the warmth in her laugh, the spark in her wit, the quiet way she used to listen without judgment. But this Grace was different. Not harder necessarily, but quieter, like someone who had locked her softness in a drawer long ago and lost the key. When she approached his table, she didn't acknowledge the weight of their shared history. She simply asked, "What can I get you?" As if they'd never touched, never kissed, never whispered dreams into each other's skin. Her voice was even, her expression unreadable, and her hands, those same hands that once ran through his hair and held on to him like he was all she had, were now steady and impersonal as she scribbled his order on a pad. Caleb opened his mouth to say something, anything, but she was already turning away, moving on to the next customer with that same quiet efficiency. The distance she placed between them wasn't physical. It was deeper than that, a kind of boundary made of years and silence and pain unspoken. And Caleb knew instinctively that this wasn't anger. It was something colder. It was acceptance. Grace had accepted long ago that he was never coming back, and now that he had, she refused to let him disturb the life she had managed to build from the wreckage he left behind. Every step she took away from his table was deliberate, a declaration that she no longer owed him recognition, explanation, or anything resembling closure. She was surviving, and survivors don't waste energy reopening wounds they've already taught themselves to live with. Caleb sat there, coffee untouched, heart beating louder than the soft clatter of dishes and idle diner chatter, realizing for the first time that perhaps the cruelest punishment wasn't being hated. It was being forgotten by the only person whose memory could still break you. There were no accusations in her voice, no trembling hands gripping the edge of the counter, no demands for explanation. Grace didn't ask him why he left where he had gone, or if he had ever once looked back. She didn't question why he had disappeared so completely from the life they might have shared. Instead, she simply carried on as if he were just another customer passing through town on his way to somewhere more important. That absence of confrontation, of curiosity, of anything remotely resembling emotional reaction, unsettled Caleb more than he expected. He had braced himself for anger, for pain, even for a slap if it came to that. But this calm dismissal was far more devastating. It was as if she had already done the work of letting go, as if she had built an entire life from the wreckage he left behind, and had no intention of reopening old wounds. She took his plate when he was done, refilled his coffee once without a word, and moved through the diner like the clock had never stopped ticking. Caleb watched her closely, noticing how she smiled at an elderly man in the corner, laughed quietly with the teenage girl bussing tables, and asked a toddler if she wanted more syrup on her pancakes. She still had that softness, that quiet way of making people feel safe. But none of it was for him. Not anymore. It was as if the space he once occupied had been swept clean, replaced with silence and resolve. And the worst part was he knew he deserved it. Every second of that cold civility, every ounce of that carefully chosen indifference was a response to the choice he made years ago when he decided she wasn't part of the life he was building. Now, sitting in the middle of that little diner, watching the woman he had once loved live a life that no longer had room for him, Caleb Morgan realized that sometimes the deepest wounds are the ones no one speaks about. Not because they don't matter, but because they've already scarred too deeply to touch. The silence between them wasn't just the absence of sound, it was presence thick and echoing, pressing against every corner of the small diner, like a fog that neither of them could push away. It was the kind of silence that carried weight not because of what was said, but because of what had been buried long ago, and now threatened to rise without permission. Caleb sat with his hands clasped, elbows on the table, eyes trained on the coffee swirling in his mug, trying to appear composed while his insides churned with memories he had spent nearly a decade trying to forget. But now, in the presence of Grace, alive, whole, unchanged in some ways and yet hardened in others, those memories came back uninvited and merciless. The late-night talks on her apartment floor, the way her laughter used to fill every empty space in him the moment she told him she was pregnant, and how he froze, told her he needed time-space clarity, and then never called again. At the time, he had justified it as self-preservation, had told himself she'd be better off without the mess of his life, without his ambitions swallowing everything soft. But now, faced with her silence, he saw it for what it really was: cowardice, a convenient exit. And that silence she gave him now wasn't passive. It was earned. It was built one painful day at a time after she must have realized he wasn't coming back. It was a wall she had every right to build, and he could feel the coldness of its shadow from across the room. Grace moved around him like he wasn't there, not with malice but with intention. She wasn't pretending he didn't exist, she was choosing not to remember, because remembering meant reopening a door that had once slammed shut in her face. Caleb felt the heaviness in his chest grow. He couldn't ask her to speak, couldn't demand the past to rise from its grave, just because he was finally ready to face it. All he could do was sit there, swallowed by the silence, and realize that sometimes when someone stops speaking to you, it's not because they have nothing to say, it's because they've said it all, cried it all, screamed it all in the years you weren't there to listen. Caleb sat in the booth with his hands resting awkwardly on either side of the chipped table, his fingers twitching now and then as if unsure of what to do, where to rest, or how to belong in a place that felt too intimate and too foreign all at once. His eyes followed Grace as she moved about the diner, not in longing but in quiet desperation, as though watching her somehow validated that she was real, that this moment was real, and not a trick of memory or guilt. He had faced boardroom battles, market crashes, lawsuits, and betrayals from people who had smiled while stabbing him in the back, but nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for the kind of emotional paralysis he felt now. There were 1,000 things he wanted to say, to explain, to ask. Did you keep the letters I never sent? Did you hate me when I left? Did it break you? Or did it set you free? But all of it stayed trapped behind his teeth because part of him feared the answers, and the other part feared that she no longer cared enough to give them. He felt exposed in a way he never had before, stripped of title power and certainty. Here, he wasn't a billionaire or a CEO. He was just a man who had once made the unforgivable choice to abandon someone who had trusted him, and now sat in the ruins of what might have been. The clatter of plates and silverware around him became a distant hum, like background noise in a dream where the only clarity existed in Grace's deliberate avoidance of him. His chest ached with something unnameable, not just regret, but the kind of sorrow that sinks deep into your bones when you realize you've come home too late and the door is still locked, not out of cruelty, but because someone else had to learn how to close it without you. And still, he said nothing, afraid that even a single word might cause everything to shatter. The next morning, restless and unable to sleep, Caleb left the motel and wandered through the waking streets of Willow Creek, his hands tucked deep into the pockets of his coat, despite the summer air. The town was quieter than he expected, as if it hadn't fully decided whether to wake up or keep dreaming, and that eerie stillness settled over him like a fog. He passed the same old storefronts, the same tired sidewalks, the same lampposts leaning slightly to one side as though exhausted by years of standing upright. As he approached the small park near the post office, a flicker of movement caught his eye. Something small and still barely noticeable on a weathered bench under the shade of a crooked tree. At first he thought it was just a bundle of clothes, or perhaps a sleeping dog. But as he stepped closer, the shape came into focus: a child. A little girl no older than 8 or 9, curled up tightly with her knees to her chest and her arms wrapped protectively around a worn canvas backpack. Her hair was messy, falling in strands across her face, and her shoes, if they could even be called that, were scuffed and thin, barely clinging to her feet. Her breathing was soft but steady, and she slept like someone used to sleeping in places that weren't meant for sleeping. Caleb's footsteps slowed instinctively. Something about her tugged at him, not just pity, but familiarity, a strange pull in his chest that made it impossible to walk away. He stood there unmoving, watching this fragile form, resting alone in a world that clearly hadn't been kind. And as the morning sun broke through the trees and cast long shadows across the cracked pavement, he realized with a sudden jolt that there was something in her face, something in the curve of her brow, the tilt of her chin that echoed back at him like a whisper from another life. It was too soon to understand what it meant, but not too soon to feel it. As the girl stirred awake, her lashes fluttered before her eyes slowly opened, cautious and alert in the way children become when the world has taught them not to trust too easily. She didn't cry out or flinch, only sat up with slow, measured movements, clutching her backpack tighter to her chest as she studied Caleb with quiet intensity. He knelt a few feet away, careful not to get too close, speaking gently, as if afraid to break the stillness. "Hey," he said softly, offering the faintest of smiles. "You okay out here?" The girl didn't answer right away, her eyes a deep brown laced with something far older than her years, scanned his face like she was assessing whether he was a threat or just another adult pretending to care. "I'm fine," she finally said, her voice small but steady. "I wasn't asking for help." Caleb raised his hands in surrender, nodding. "I know. I just saw you here. Thought maybe you were waiting for someone." She looked away, her gaze drifting toward the street. "I wasn't. I just come here when Mom's working." He tilted his head. "Your mom works in town." She nodded. "At the diner. The one on the corner with the broken sign." Caleb's heart skipped. "Grace's table." The girl nodded again, pulling her knees tighter. "She works mornings. I don't like being there when it's busy." There was something raw in her honesty, something that made Caleb feel both protective and suddenly inexplicably exposed. He studied her face more closely now, the soft line of her jaw, the slight furrow between her brows. When she spoke, the fierce independence in her posture that was far too familiar. He tried to keep his voice even. "What's your name?" She paused for a long beat before answering. "Sophie." And in that moment something shifted. The air around him thickened. Caleb felt the ground beneath him tilt, because now he understood exactly what had drawn him to her before he knew her name. Those eyes, that name, that face. She wasn't just any child. She was his. The longer Caleb looked at Sophie, the harder it became to convince himself that what he saw was just coincidence. Her features, though still rounded with childhood, bore the undeniable echoes of someone he once knew too intimately to forget. There was a sharpness to her cheekbones that mirrored his own, a stubborn lift to her chin that had lived on his face since boyhood, and eyes, those eyes, that held the same solemn, steady gaze Grace once gave him the night she told him she believed in him, even when he no longer did. But it wasn't just the physical resemblance that unsettled him. It was the way she looked at the world with that guarded curiosity, that quiet calculation, as if she expected something to be taken from her at any moment. Caleb had seen that look in the mirror during his most isolated years, and now here it was, again worn by a child who shouldn't have had to learn such emotional armor so early. As Sophie sat on that weathered bench, hugging her backpack and glancing sideways at him, without fully letting down her defenses, It was like watching two timelines collide: the man he used to be and the little girl who had lived the consequences of his absence. He had no proof yet, no DNA test or confession from Grace, but his gut knew what logic hadn't yet spoken aloud. This wasn't just a lost child. She was his child. The ache that gripped his chest wasn't born of surprise. It was guilt-heavy, sour, and ancient. All at once he realized the staggering cost of the choice he'd made years ago to disappear, to prioritize ambition over love, reputation over responsibility. He had told himself that walking away was cleaner, simpler, less messy than staying. But now, staring at Sophie's face, the perfect blend of a past he abandoned and a future he never knew existed, he understood that nothing about what he'd done had ever been simple. It had just been selfish. As Caleb watched Sophie adjust the straps on her worn-out backpack and brush the hair from her face, something deep inside him shifted. A recognition that went beyond features or gut instinct. It was in the way she moved, the way her eyes lingered on the details. Others missed the way she seemed to carry the weight of things too big for her age. She wasn't just a child shaped by difficult circumstances. She was a mirror of parts of himself he rarely let anyone see. The thought crept in quietly at first, like a whisper he was afraid to entertain. Could she be mine? And once that whisper entered his mind, it refused to leave. He began noticing more the way her brow furrowed slightly when she was confused, how she stayed quiet, not out of shyness but out of watchfulness. How her voice dropped when she said her mother's name like it was a soft promise. Grace. Sophie had said her mother worked at the diner, and there was only one diner in this town. Grace's table. The timeline began to align in Caleb's mind like puzzle pieces that had been scattered too long. 9 years. Maybe 10. About the same time he left Grace behind without so much as a backward glance. He had buried that chapter of his life under work and money, under the illusion that detachment would erase consequences. But now, standing a few feet away from a girl who had no idea who he truly was, he felt the first undeniable moi settle into place. He didn't need a paternity test to feel the connection beginning to anchor itself into the marrow of his bones. He could see Grace in Sophie's quiet dignity, and disturbingly, unforgivably, he could see himself in the way she kept her distance, even when she longed to belong. Caleb had always prided himself on controlling outcomes, predicting risk, managing reputation. But nothing in his life had prepared him for the storm that brewed silently inside the realization that this child, this Sophie, might be the very legacy he never intended to leave behind, and the one he could no longer afford to ignore. That evening, when the diner had emptied and the last customer's footsteps faded into the hush of a closing town, Caleb remained seated in the same booth, waiting not just for a refill or a polite goodbye, but for a moment that had been building since the second he saw Sophie curled up on that bench. Grace wiped the counter with slow, practiced movements, her back to him, her presence calm but distant. The weight in his chest had grown unbearable each minute, stretching with unspoken truth pressing against the edges of his throat. He knew he couldn't leave this town, couldn't walk back into his old life until he asked the question that had been haunting him since morning. So when Grace finally turned to face him, when their eyes met in the quiet of an empty room still smelling of coffee and grease and unhealed memories, he stood, walked toward her, and spoke without preamble, without apology. "Is Sophie my daughter?" The words hung in the air, stark and heavy, slicing through the silence like a blade. Grace froze, not dramatically, not with a gasp or tears, but with the stillness of someone who had braced for this moment years ago and survived it long before it arrived. She didn't speak right away. She set the cloth down gently, folded it with precision, and only then looked at him. Her eyes were steady, but tired, like someone who had been forced to live on truth, while others ran from it. "You tell me," she said quietly. "You think she just happened to have your eyes, your silence?" Caleb felt the breath leave his lungs. He didn't need a test. He didn't need paperwork. He already knew. But hearing it, confirming it, felt like being cracked open. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, voice softer now, guilt clawing at every word. Grace didn't blink. "I tried," she said. "You wouldn't take my calls. You changed your number. Your assistant sent me away like I was selling poison." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Truth didn't always shout. Sometimes it whispered just loud enough to break you. Caleb stood there facing not just Grace, but the damage he had done. And for the first time in years, he didn't have a single word to fix it. Grace didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words came slowly, deliberately, with the precision of someone who had carried the weight of a memory for far too long and had no desire to embellish it, only to lay it bare. "I came to your office," she said, her hands still, her eyes unflinching. "I had just found out I was pregnant. I sat in the lobby for almost 2 hours holding this envelope with the ultrasound photo, trying to find the courage to face you. I wasn't asking for money. I wasn't even sure what I wanted. I just thought you deserved to know." Caleb swallowed hard, unable to look away, as if her voice had turned into a mirror he couldn't stop staring into. Grace continued, her tone flat, not cold, but numb, the kind of numbness that forms when pain has calcified into survival. "Your new assistant," some polished young woman with red lipstick and sharper words, stopped me at the front desk. I told her I knew you, that it was personal. I even tried to say your name the way you once asked me to say it. Caleb, not Mr. Morgan, but it didn't matter. She looked me up and down, asked if I had an appointment, and when I said no, she smiled like I was a sad joke and told me you were too busy to be disturbed. Then she asked me to leave. Just like that. She paused, not for effect, but because the memory still lodged itself somewhere between her ribs. I stood outside that building for another 30 minutes thinking maybe you'd come down, maybe you saw me from your office window. But you didn't. So I went home. And I raised our daughter alone. Caleb felt the shame settle into his bones, thick and undeniable. He remembered that assistant, her efficiency, her gatekeeping, her loyalty to his schedule above all else. He had trained his world to filter anything that wasn't part of his climb. And in doing so, he'd filtered out the most important truth of his life. Grace didn't look at Caleb as she spoke the next words, as if eye contact might unravel her composure or offer him sympathy he hadn't earned. She simply stared past him into a corner of the diner that no longer held customers, only ghosts. "I gave birth alone," she said, the syllables steady, almost mechanical. "My water broke 3 weeks early. I was home by myself, no family nearby, no friends left after you disappeared. I called a cab with shaking hands and prayed I could hold on long enough to make it to the hospital. The driver didn't speak much English. I remember gripping the seatbelt so hard it left bruises on my palms. The pain came fast, harder than I'd expected. By the time we pulled into the emergency lane, I was already bleeding. A nurse screamed something about placental abruption. Everything after that went blurry. Her voice cracked just barely, then hardened again. I remember the ceiling lights flashing above me as they rushed the gurney down the hallway. I remember the chill of metal under my back. But most of all, I remember thinking, this is how it ends. I'm going to die and he'll never even know she existed. Caleb's hands gripped the edge of the counter, white-knuckled and trembling. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. Grace exhaled slowly, collecting herself. I survived. Barely. Sophie spent 2 weeks in the NICU. I watched her through glass tiny and hooked up to machines, and I promised her she'd never have to need anyone who chose not to stay. Her eyes flicked to his, then sharp and unwavering. That promise got me through the nights when the power was out, when there wasn't enough money for food, when she cried from fever and I had to walk to the pharmacy because I didn't own a car. You disappeared, Caleb. But we didn't. We lived. We suffered. And we survived without you. There was no hatred in her voice, only truth. And it hurt worse than any accusation ever could. Caleb stood frozen in place, his breath shallow, his world collapsing inward with every word Grace had spoken. The polished veneer he had spent years constructing, powerful CEO, calculated decision-maker, untouchable figure of success, meant nothing in this moment. None of it could shield him from the raw truth that now pulsed like fire beneath his skin while he was closing million-dollar deals in glass towers. The woman he had once loved was nearly dying in the back of a cab alone, terrified and bleeding with his child inside her. The silence stretched thick between them, not empty, but suffocating, filled with everything he didn't know, everything he'd chosen not to know, and the unbearable reality that he couldn't change the past, no matter how much he now wished he could. He opened his mouth once, then again, but no words came. What could he possibly say to a woman who had nearly died bringing his daughter into the world while he sat in boardrooms completely unaware? What apology could begin to reach the depth of a truth he had buried so deep he convinced even himself it never existed? His chest tightened painfully, the weight of guilt heavier than anything he'd carried in business or life. Caleb prided himself on being a man who always had the right answer, who never lost control. But now, staring into Grace's unwavering eyes, all he could do was stand there, hollow, stripped bare of all defenses. He remembered every moment he had ignored her calls, every time he'd told himself that moving forward was cleaner than looking back, every excuse he'd made to justify his silence. And now those excuses lay in ruins at his feet, useless and cowardly. Grace had suffered. Sophie had grown up without a father, and it was his fault, entirely. The shame was bone deep, and in that quiet, breathless moment, Caleb Morgan understood that redemption wouldn't come in words. It would have to be earned, and maybe it was already too late. Caleb didn't sleep that night. He lay awake in the cramped motel room, staring at the ceiling fan as it turned with a soft, uneven hum, its rhythm no match for the storm unraveling inside him. Grace's words echoed through his chest, raw, unforgiving, true. The guilt didn't just linger. It settled into every breath, a quiet reckoning he couldn't silence. By morning he knew he couldn't leave, not yet. Not when Sophie walked these streets, not when Grace had survived a war he never even knew was being fought. He returned to the diner early, long before the regulars shuffled in, and stood at the threshold like a man unsure if he'd be welcomed or turned away. Grace looked up from behind the counter, her expression unreadable. He walked toward her slowly, stripped of all ego, all certainty, every word rehearsed and discarded a dozen times in his head. "I know I don't deserve anything from you," he began, voice low, heavy with humility. "But I need to ask something. I want to stay. Just a few days. Not to fix everything I know I can't, but to try, to understand, to be present, if even for a moment in the life I walked away from." Grace didn't speak right away. She studied him with the same careful eyes she had worn the night before, as if weighing the risk of letting him come closer against the years she had spent building a world without him. Caleb pressed on quietly. "I don't expect forgiveness. And I'm not here to disrupt your life. I need to see her. I need to see Sophie smile or roll her eyes at me or tell me I've got it all wrong. I need to know the daughter I never had the courage to meet." He paused, then added softer, "Please, let me stay. Let me try to be something to her, even if it's just a memory she won't have to erase." And for the first time he waited, not as a man used to getting what he wanted, but as a father finally showing up far too late. Caleb didn't try to reclaim lost years with grand gestures or dramatic apologies. Instead, he started with the smallest things, the things no one else would have noticed, but that meant everything in the quiet rhythm of Grace and Sophie's life. The first morning he asked if he could walk Sophie to school. She blinked at him suspiciously, backpack slung over one shoulder, eyes narrowed as if waiting for the catch. But when he held out a granola bar and said, "I read online that these are cool," now she snorted and took it without a word. It wasn't much, but it was something. After she disappeared down the sidewalk, he walked back to the diner where Grace was changing a flickering bulb in the back pantry. He took the bulb from her, wordlessly climbed the creaking stool and screwed in a fresh one he had picked up from the hardware store that morning. Grace didn't thank him, but she didn't stop him either. That night he offered to cook. The stove sputtered, and he nearly burned the eggs, but when Sophie took one bite and muttered, "Not bad for a beginner," he felt like he'd won a medal. He stayed to wash dishes, rolling up his sleeves and plunging his hands into the soapy sink while Grace dried quietly beside him. It was strange how natural it felt, how right, but also how fragile, as if one wrong word might shatter the tenuous thread holding this new version of him together. Over the next few days, he fixed the squeaky hinge on Sophie's closet door, patched the screen on the front porch, and showed up every morning, every evening with no agenda, but to be there. He didn't push, didn't pry, didn't pretend to be a father she already had. He was just Caleb, the man who once disappeared, now showing up with steady hands, quiet eyes, and a heart wide open for whatever scraps of belonging they might be willing to offer back. It started quietly, like most miracles do not, with fireworks or declarations, but with a single question from Sophie over breakfast. "Did you always hate eggs?" she asked, poking at her own plate while watching him out of the corner of her eye. Caleb looked up, startled by her voice. Not because she was speaking, but because for the first time she was choosing to speak to him, not just around him. Pretty much, he replied with a half smile. "Scrambled eggs always made me gag as a kid. My nanny used to bribe me with comic books." Sophie smirked, then nodded approvingly. "I'd hold out for a bike." That small exchange cracked something open between them. Not a flood, but a slow, steady leak of trust. Later that day, she sat at the coffee table with a box of colored pencils and thick paper and began sketching. Caleb watched from the kitchen, unsure if he should approach. She didn't invite him, but she didn't tell him to leave either. Her pencil moved quickly, confidently, each line etched with quiet purpose. She didn't speak for nearly an hour, then finally turned the paper toward him without looking up. It was a sketch of the diner, impossibly detailed from the chipped salt shaker to the frayed edge of the curtain in the back window. "You drew this from memory?" he asked, awed. She shrugged. "I see things. It's easier to draw them than say them." He nodded slowly, recognizing something in her he hadn't known to look for before, a part of himself he'd buried under years of ambition and silence. The next day, she handed him another drawing. This time, it was the bench in the park with two figures, one small, curled up, the other tall, standing quietly nearby. No words were needed. That was how Sophie spoke. Not with declarations or forgiveness, but with color and shape and space. Caleb didn't push. He simply said, "You're really good at this." And for the first time, she smiled, not just politely, but freely. It wasn't everything, but it was a beginning. One quiet afternoon, as the sunlight filtered through the small living room window and spilled across the hardwood floor in golden stripes, Caleb found Sophie sitting cross-legged on the rug, completely absorbed in a new drawing. Her brows were furrowed in concentration, lips pressed into a thoughtful line, and her hand moved in smooth, deliberate strokes. He didn't interrupt her. He had learned by now that Sophie's art was sacred ground not to be disturbed. Instead, he watched from the doorway, unsure what she was creating, but mesmerized by her quiet intensity. It wasn't until she finally stood up and walked over, arms folded behind her back, shy in a way he hadn't seen before, that he realized something was different. She held out the drawing without a word. Caleb took it gently and stared. At first, he couldn't speak. It was a house, not just any house, but one with yellow shutters, a crooked chimney, and a little swing hanging from a tree in the front yard. In front of the house stood three figures: a tall man with messy hair, a woman with kind eyes and an apron, and a little girl holding both their hands. There were smiles on all their faces, and above them, in Sophie's small but careful handwriting, were three words: "My real family." Caleb felt the air leave his lungs. His throat tightened, and he had to blink back the sudden sting in his eyes. This wasn't just a picture. It was a dream hers. A vision of a life she had never known but still longed for, quietly, patiently, without ever saying it aloud. He looked at her, and for the first time, she didn't look away. "Do you think it's stupid?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Caleb shook his head slowly, his voice thick with emotion. "No, Sophie. I think it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." She nodded once and returned to her crayons. No hug, no tears. Just that drawing left on the table like a key placed gently in his hand. And in that moment, Caleb understood this was an invitation not to fix the past, but to build something better from its ashes. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of day that felt almost normal. Caleb had just finished helping Grace restock the pantry behind the diner, while Sophie sat outside on the curb, her sketchbook balanced on her knees, as she carefully shaded the outline of a dog passing by. The sky was clear, the breeze warm, and for a fleeting moment, Caleb allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this fragile, hard-earned peace could hold. That illusion shattered the moment a black SUV pulled up across the street, its tinted windows reflecting the diner's faded sign. The door swung open and a man stepped out, sharp suit, slicked back hair, and a predatory kind of calm that Caleb recognized instantly. Bryce Langford, former business partner, master manipulator. The man who had once called Caleb's decision to walk away from Grace a smart career move. Caleb's gut tightened. Bryce didn't walk. He glided all polished charm and dangerous confidence as if the town itself wasn't worthy of his presence. And then without hesitation he raised his phone and snapped a photo directly at Sophie. She didn't notice. She was too focused on her drawing brow, furrowed in concentration, legs swinging absently. But Caleb saw. His blood froze. The flash had been subtle, almost invisible in daylight, but he knew Bryce's habits, his precision. This wasn't an accident. Bryce had come here knowing. Caleb stormed out of the diner, every protective instinct flaring. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he growled. Bryce smiled like a man already holding the upper hand. "Relax, Caleb. Cute kid. She looks familiar." He said it slowly, every word laced with implication. Caleb stepped between him and Sophie instinctively. Bryce tucked his phone back into his pocket. "You've been hiding, my friend, but not very well. And now that I know what you're hiding," he trailed off, smirking, "let's just say this changes everything." Caleb didn't speak. Couldn't. Because he knew in that moment the life he was trying to build had just been marked. And the man standing before him didn't come for closure. He came for leverage. The headline hit the internet like a storm breaking a quiet sky. Billionaire Caleb Morgan's secret love child exposed in small-town scandal. It was plastered across gossip blogs, financial tabloids, and social media feeds within hours, accompanied by a grainy photo of Sophie sitting on the curb with her sketchbook, her face tilted toward the sun in quiet innocence. The image was paired with older press shots of Caleb in expensive suits and sleek offices, the contrast meant to provoke outrage and intrigue. How could a man so powerful have hidden something so personal for so long? Caleb saw the article by accident, or so he told himself. In truth, he had felt the shift in the air the moment Bryce left town, like a fuse had been lit under the fragile peace he had tried to build. Now the explosion had arrived. Reporters flooded his corporate PR line. Shareholders demanded answers. Board members scheduled emergency meetings. And through it all, the question wasn't about Sophie's safety or dignity. It was about Caleb's brand, his image, his value. Grace found out when two strangers with cameras showed up outside the diner pretending to be customers. Sophie heard her name whispered on a radio at the gas station. The damage wasn't just public. It was personal, invasive, and cruel. Caleb sat on the front porch that evening, phone buzzing non-stop in his hand, ignored. His silence wasn't strategy, it was helplessness. How could he explain to a hungry world that the daughter they now turned into clickbait wasn't a secret he had hidden out of shame, but a truth he had once been too broken to claim? Grace paced in the kitchen, fury and fear etched across her face. Sophie sat at the table, silent, clutching her drawing pencils like armor. The dream she had drawn, the home with 3 smiling faces, felt impossibly far away now. And Caleb, for the first time, wasn't sure if he could still protect it. Grace was already pacing when Caleb walked through the door, her arms folded tightly across her chest, and her eyes lit with the kind of fury that didn't need volume to make its presence felt. The news had spread faster than either of them could contain. And now, it wasn't just whispers or stares, it was harm, real and immediate. "She came home crying," Grace said through clenched teeth, barely looking at him. "Sophie, my daughter, our daughter, crying. Because some kid at school asked if she was the reason your fortune might shrink." Caleb froze, the weight of those words hitting him harder than any headline ever could. Another one called her a mistake. Grace continued, her voice trembling now, not with weakness but with rage. They laughed at her in the hallway. One girl said her mom saw Sophie's picture on a gossip blog and that she's probably just a paycheck baby. Caleb's stomach churned. He had seen what the internet could do, had benefited from its reach when it served his empire. But now that same machinery had turned its teeth on a child who had done nothing but exist. "I tried to get the school to take it seriously," Grace said, shaking her head. "You know what they told me? That kids can be cruel, and maybe it's best to keep Sophie out for a few days until things blow over. Like it's her fault. Like she asked for this." Caleb stepped forward, guilt pressing against his ribs like a vice. "I didn't think Bryce would—" "No," Grace cut him off, eyes blazing. "You didn't think. That's the problem. You came here trying to make amends, and now you've brought cameras, headlines, and humiliation to a little girl who just wanted to draw in peace." In the corner of the room, Sophie sat on the couch, knees pulled to her chest, her sketchbook unopened beside her. She didn't cry. She just looked at the floor like someone learning far too early how the world punishes quiet hearts. Caleb had no defense, only the crushing truth his past had once abandoned them. Now his present had betrayed them again. Caleb found Bryce exactly where he expected, sitting on the patio of a luxury hotel just outside town, sipping an overpriced whiskey like a man completely unbothered by the damage he had unleashed. The view behind him stretched wide, all rolling hills and serenity, but Caleb saw none of it. He walked up with steady steps and fire in his chest, his fists clenched, his voice low and lethal. "You crossed a line," he said without preamble. Bryce looked up, smirking, unshaken. "Relax, Caleb. It's just publicity. The world loves a scandal, especially when it comes with a redemption arc. You should be thanking me. You photographed a child without consent." Caleb snapped, his voice cold steel. "You exposed her life, humiliated her mother, and for what? A headline." Leverage Bryce leaned back in his chair, swirling the ice in his glass. "Don't be dramatic. You were hiding her. That's not good for business, not for shareholders. Now everyone knows. You're free. Or are you just mad because the fairy tale blew up before you could finish rewriting it?" Caleb stepped closer, jaw tight. "I left once. I walked away from Grace, from a child I didn't even know existed. That was the biggest mistake of my life. But I won't do it again. Not for you. Not for the board. Not for anyone." Bryce raised an eyebrow. "So what now?" "You play house in a broken town and give up everything you built." Caleb didn't hesitate. "If that's what it takes to protect them, yes. I'll choose them over everything. Every time." There was no bluff in his voice, no hesitation in his stance. This wasn't the Caleb Morgan Bryce once knew, the one obsessed with image, with power, with distance. This was a man who had found something real, something fragile and worth fighting for, and he was no longer afraid to lose what wasn't real to begin with. Bryce scoffed, muttered something under his breath, but Caleb was already walking away, leaving the whiskey, the view, and the world he once lived in behind. The press conference was held in the modest town hall building, nothing like the grand venues Caleb Morgan was used to, but that was exactly the point. No marble podiums, no velvet curtains, no PR firm rehearsing every line. Just a folding table, a cheap microphone, and a row of local and national reporters seated shoulder to shoulder, hungry for sound bites. Caleb stood alone at the front, dressed not in a designer suit but in a plain navy sweater and worn jeans. There were no bodyguards, no corporate entourage, just him, a man finally ready to face what he had once run from. The cameras flicked on lenses, clicking in a staccato rhythm that mirrored the thud of his heartbeat. He looked out at the crowd, took a breath, and began. "My name is Caleb Morgan. I've built companies, led teams, and stood on stages like this for most of my adult life. But nothing I've ever done, not a single deal or dollar earned, matters more than what I'm about to say." The room fell still. 9 years ago, I made a choice I will regret for the rest of my life. I walked away from someone I loved, and in doing so, I lost the chance to know the most important person I've ever met. He paused, his voice tightening. "Her name is Sophie. She is my daughter." The words landed with the weight of truth, unpolished and raw. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but Caleb didn't flinch. She didn't ask for headlines. She didn't ask to be dragged into my world. She deserves peace, protection, and a father who shows up not in private, not in secret, but publicly and proudly. He placed a photo of Sophie on the table, one she had drawn herself, the three of them in front of a yellow house. I am not here to spin a story. I'm here to take responsibility. Fully. I am her father, and I will never abandon her again. Then he stepped back, not with the arrogance of a man used to applause, but with the quiet strength of a man who had finally chosen truth over image and family over fear. Caleb stood still for a moment after declaring Sophie as his daughter, letting the weight of his words settle over the crowd, the cameras, the air itself. But he wasn't finished, not until he said the part that mattered most. His voice softened, the public edge dropping away, leaving only a man stripped of pride standing on a stage he never imagined needing. Before I end, he said, looking down for a brief second before raising his eyes again, I want to say something not to the press, not to the public, but directly to two people who matter more than all of this. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper creased at the corners, written in his own messy scrawl. He didn't read from it. He just held it as if its presence gave him the strength to continue. To Grace, he began, eyes searching the lens as though she were watching from home. I abandoned you when you needed me most. I chose fear over responsibility, image over truth. And while I have no right to ask anything from you, I need to say this where the world can hear it. I'm sorry. Deeply. Utterly. I see now what I didn't. Back then, your strength, your courage, your unimaginable grace in raising Sophie alone. You didn't just survive, you raised a brilliant, kind, extraordinary girl without a shred of help from me. His voice cracked, but he didn't look away. And to Sophie, he continued, eyes bright, hand gripping the podium. I was not there when you were born. I didn't hold your hand through fevers, scraped knees, or nightmares. I didn't deserve your drawings or your quiet trust. But from this day forward, I will earn it. I will show up not just as your father, but as the man who finally understands what that word means. The room was quiet, the kind of silence that happens when the truth finally lands. This isn't a press statement, he finished. It's a public apology, one that's long overdue. And this time when he stepped back, it was not as Caleb Morgan, the billionaire, but as a father trying at last to make things right. Caleb let the final words of his apology hang in the air, his voice still echoing in the hushed stillness of the room. But he wasn't done, not yet. There was one more truth, one more decision that had been growing inside him since the moment he saw Sophie's drawing of a home with 3 smiling figures and realized how far he'd strayed from what truly mattered. He took a breath, steadying himself, then leaned back toward the microphone, not with bravado, but with a calm certainty that silenced the last of the murmurs in the room. There's one more thing I need to say. He began, his voice clear-grounded. For nearly 2 decades, I've led Morgan Ventures. I built it from nothing through sleepless nights, impossible deals, and sacrifices I once believed were worth it. I became someone the world respected. But somewhere along the way, I lost the part of me that knew what really matters. I became a man who could abandon the woman he loved and never look back. I became a man who didn't even know he had a daughter until it was too late. He looked out at the crowd, and for the first time there was no armor behind his eyes. I can't undo the years I missed, but I can choose what kind of man I'll be from this day forward. That's why, effective immediately, I'm stepping down as CEO of Morgan Ventures. Not temporarily, not as a PR strategy, permanently. The press reacted with gasps, scribbles, clicking keyboards, but Caleb didn't flinch. This is not a resignation of defeat, he continued. It's a beginning. I'm not retiring. I'm starting over, not as a business leader, not as a headline, but as a father. I want to walk my daughter to school. I want to burn pancakes on Saturday mornings and fix broken shelves and be there, truly there for the moments that don't make the news, but make a life. He paused, then added quietly, if I can rebuild anything worth having, it starts not in boardrooms but at home. And with that, Caleb Morgan, the billionaire who once had everything, chose to become the father who finally understood what mattered most. In the days following Caleb's press conference, the world buzzed with noise. Headlines screamed across every digital platform: "Billionaire resigns to raise secret daughter from boardroom to playground. Caleb Morgan's redemption arc." Is this the end of Morgan Ventures? The media swarmed the town, cameras hovered near the diner, and online forums erupted with speculation, some praising his courage, others sneering at the timing, calling it a calculated move to restore his image. For a while, even the townsfolk kept their distance. People whispered behind grocery aisles, paused their conversations when he entered the post office, and eyed him with the quiet skepticism reserved for outsiders with baggage. Grace stayed composed but guarded, and Sophie withdrew again, her sketchbook untouched on the table for 3 days straight. Caleb didn't push. He simply stayed. He swept the diner floor without being asked, carried groceries for Mrs. Langdon down the block, and fixed the broken bell on the church door in his spare time. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the air began to shift. It started with a nod from Mr. Travis, the hardware store owner, and a cup of coffee left on Caleb's table by Alma, the diner's oldest waitress, who muttered, "On the house for trying." Then came a moment when Sophie got up to read her poem during school assembly, her voice trembling, and the auditorium, once full of whispers, fell silent, then erupted in applause. Grace's eyes welled up. The whispers stopped. One by one, neighbors began to see not just the scandal but the effort. Not the past, but the man who was showing up every day without fanfare, without expectation. He wasn't buying back approval, he was earning it brick by quiet brick. By the end of the month, the town that once saw him as a fallen icon began to welcome him as something else entirely, a father, a neighbor, and maybe one of their own. It happened on an ordinary evening, the kind that didn't announce itself with grand moments or perfect lighting, but unfolded in the gentle hush of everyday life. Grace had just finished washing dishes, sleeves rolled up, hair tucked behind her ear in that quiet way Caleb had come to love. Sophie was in the living room, humming softly as she sketched the sound of pencil strokes against paper, a kind of background music to their new fragile piece. The sun had dipped behind the hills, leaving the house bathed in the amber glow of a single lamp. Caleb was drying the plates when he turned to her heart, thudding with a weight that wasn't nerves but clarity. He had thought about elaborate ways to do it, floral arrangements, candlelit dinners, maybe even a string quartet flown in from the city. But none of that felt true. This woman didn't need spectacle. She needed truth. She needed presence. So he sat down, the towel, reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple ring, one he had chosen weeks ago, but carried like a secret, waiting for the moment to feel right. And this, he realized, was the moment. Quiet, uncomplicated, honest. "Grace," he said, his voice low and steady. "I don't have a speech. I don't have promises wrapped in perfect words. All I have is this: I want to spend the rest of my life showing up, not with apologies, but with dinner on the table, with rides to school, with being there when the car won't start or Sophie forgets her lines at the play. I want to be the man who stays. And if you'll let me, if you'll have me, I want to do all of that, not just as Sophie's father, but as your husband." Grace didn't speak at first. Her hands trembled, eyes full of something unspoken but overflowing. And then in the softest voice he'd ever heard from her, she said, "You already are." Caleb didn't present a diamond ring, not because he couldn't. He could have bought an entire jewelry store without blinking, but because the moment didn't ask for gold or sparkle. It asked for truth, for something real, quiet, and rooted in what they had slowly begun to build together. So instead of opening a velvet box, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn keychain, soft pink plastic, shaped like a heart, slightly smudged at the edges with a hand-drawn sketch etched in permanent marker. A house with 3 stick figures, one tall, one with long hair, one small, smiling with arms wide. At the top, in Sophie's careful handwriting, were the words, "Home is here." Grace's breath caught when she saw it. Her eyes immediately filled, not with disbelief, but with recognition. She remembered when Sophie had made it just a few days after the press conference, when the town was still buzzing with headlines and whispers. Grace had found her sitting cross-legged on the porch, tongue tucked in concentration as she pressed the marker down too hard and said, "I want to give this to Mommy." so she never forgets what we look like together. At the time, Grace had hugged her, kissed the top of her head, and said thank you. But she hadn't known Caleb had quietly picked it up afterward, tucked it into his coat like a talisman. Now, standing before her with hands slightly shaking and that pink plastic heart between his fingers, he said, "I don't need diamonds to prove anything. Sophie gave me this, and it means more than anything I've ever owned. I want to build that house with you, the one she drew. I want to be the man who makes that picture real." Grace didn't reach for the keychain at first. She reached for his hands, cupped them between hers, and whispered, "We already live in that house. You just finally found the door." Caleb held Grace's hands, their fingers gently entwined, and in that quiet space between them, the world seemed to slow. There were no violins, no witnesses, no grand ceremony, just the hum of the refrigerator in the background, the warmth of the kitchen light, and the muffled sound of Sophie's pencil still sketching in the other room. But in that simplicity, something sacred unfolded. Caleb's voice was low, almost trembling, not with fear, but with the fragile weight of honesty. I've made promises before, he began, not looking away from her eyes, big ones, corporate deals, public speeches, vows I never really meant or didn't understand. But this is different. He paused, breathing in the moment, anchoring himself in it. "I'm not going to promise you perfection, Grace. I've already failed too many times to pretend I'll never falter again. I'll mess up. I'll forget things. I'll say the wrong words. I may even burn breakfast more times than Sophie can count." That made her smile through tears, and he squeezed her hands gently. "But what I can promise is this," he continued, voice steady. "Now I won't leave. Not when it's hard. Not when we fight. Not when life throws more at us than we think we can handle. I won't walk away like I did before. I won't disappear when it's inconvenient. I won't let fear dictate the kind of man I am anymore." His thumb brushed over her knuckles as he added, "I promise to be here, to stay. That's all I have to offer, not flawless love, but faithful presence." Grace's eyes glistened as she nodded, and in that wordless agreement the air shifted. It wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't a Hollywood ending. It was a beginning made of second chances, hard-earned trust, and one simple vow that mattered more than any diamond ring or polished speech, "I won't leave." And in a world that often offered everything but presence, that promise was everything. Grace had never imagined this moment not like this. Not in a quiet kitchen with a chipped countertop and a flickering light overhead, not with Sophie humming softly in the other room and the scent of leftover pasta still in the air. Yet as Caleb stood before her, offering not grand promises but steady presence, not jewels, but the small pink keychain their daughter had made, something inside her cracked open in a way that wasn't painful but healing. The tears came slowly at first, not dramatic but quiet, the kind that slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them. She didn't wipe them away. She let them fall because every one of them carried the weight of years spent alone in the delivery room in the dark of night, comforting a sick child in the silence of holidays with no one else around. They carried the hurt of being left, the exhaustion of surviving, and the stubborn hope she never fully let go of, even when she told herself she had. She looked at Caleb. Really looked and saw not the polished man who once walked away, but the man who had returned, the one who stayed through the storm of headlines, the one who fixed light bulbs, burned pancakes, and knelt beside their daughter when she had nightmares. The man who had learned to listen. Grace reached for his hands, her voice barely audible through the tightness in her throat. "You broke my heart once," she whispered, "and for a long time I didn't think I'd ever trust you again. But you didn't just say the words. You showed up. You stayed. And I think I've been waiting to believe you would." Her hands trembled in his as she added, "So no, I don't need perfect. I don't need rich. I don't need rescue. I just need real." And then, with tears streaking down her cheeks and a smile that trembled at the edges, she nodded, "Yes, Caleb. I'll marry you." And in that moment, without applause or music or cameras, they built the foundation of something rare, something scarred but strong, quiet but unshakable. Something real. The little house at the edge of town was nothing extraordinary by most standards. 2 bedrooms, creaky floorboards, a leaky faucet that Caleb still hadn't gotten around to fixing. But to the 3 people who lived inside it, it was everything. It was peace. It was laughter echoing off chipped walls. The smell of pancakes on Saturday mornings. The sound of Sophie's soft humming while she sketched at the kitchen table. It was the way Grace lit up when she read a new recipe aloud, the way Caleb would glance at her mid-sentence just to watch her smile. It was the way Sophie fell asleep most nights curled up with her drawings at the foot of their bed before Caleb carried her gently to her own room. Their days followed a rhythm now, quiet, simple, and grounding. Caleb would walk Sophie to school holding her hand while she recited facts about animals or explained her newest story idea. Grace opened the diner at 7 sharp, and Caleb often stayed behind to sweep fix or build something with his hands, things he once paid others to do, but now found oddly sacred. In the evenings, they cooked together, danced in the living room to old records, or lay on the porch wrapped in blankets, naming constellations Sophie invented on the spot. There were no luxury cars in the driveway, no designer suits in the closet, just worn jeans, mismatched mugs, and the comforting clutter of a life fully lived. And somehow, despite the headlines, despite the hurt they had once carried like armor, the little house held them in a kind of stillness that none of them had known before. It wasn't perfect. They argued sometimes. Caleb burned dinner. Grace forgot appointments. Sophie had bad days at school. But there was love now, steady, unquestioned love in the way they stayed. In the way they returned to each other day after day, not because they had to, but because they chose to. And in that quiet choosing, the little house at the edge of town became a home. Caleb had always believed in building things, companies, systems, legacies, but after everything he no longer cared about empires made of glass towers or billion-dollar valuations. What he wanted to build now was something that mattered, not to shareholders, but to children who had once been invisible like Sophie. That's how the Sophie Foundation was born, not in a boardroom, but in the warmth of their living room with Sophie asleep on the couch and Grace resting her head on Caleb's shoulder. He had been staring at one of Sophie's drawings, another heart, but this one filled with smaller houses, tiny figures holding hands, and the idea came to him like a whisper. What if no child ever had to feel as abandoned as she once had? Within a month, Caleb had repurposed his remaining assets, liquidating parts of Morgan Ventures and redirecting them toward the foundation. He didn't want it to be another vanity project or PR stunt. There would be no gala dinners, no donor walls with engraved names. The Sophie Foundation would work quietly and deliberately, funding legal assistance for single mothers pushed into silence, creating shelters that prioritized dignity over numbers, and establishing art programs for children who process trauma, not with words, but with pictures like Sophie had. Each program was designed with one question in mind: what would have helped Grace and Sophie the most when they were alone? The answers shaped every initiative. A scholarship fund was named Grace's Promise. A nationwide hotline was set up not for adoption, but for protection and reunification. In interviews, Caleb spoke little of his past mistakes, only of the future he wanted to help build, where no child would feel like a secret and no mother would be left at a hospital bed with no one to call. And though the world still remembered him as the billionaire who walked away and came back in town, people had started calling him something else entirely: the man who stayed and made it count. Sophie had always drawn in silence, her pencils whispering across the page, while the world around her bustled with noise. But one afternoon, as the late autumn light poured gently through the kitchen window, Caleb noticed something different. She wasn't just doodling this time, she was building something page by page, sketch by sketch, a quiet story taking shape beneath her careful hands. At first, he didn't ask. He respected her space the way Grace had taught him, by waiting, not pushing. But one evening, Sophie looked up from her notebook, her eyes wide but steady, and said, "It's a book about a little girl who was lost, and then found something she didn't know she was looking for." She slid the first pages across the table, and Caleb's heart tightened as he saw himself through her eyes. Not the powerful man from magazines, but the tall, shadowy figure she had once dreamed about, faceless and far away. The story was simple but profound. a girl with messy hair and bright eyes, lives in a quiet town where she draws maps made of bottle caps and follows whispers in the wind. Along the way, she meets a man who looks tired and broken, and at first she isn't sure if she can trust him. But slowly, the man begins to fix things, not just broken chairs and leaky faucets, but the sadness that lives behind her eyes. The drawings were soft and expressive, with small hearts hidden in corners like secrets only she could find. Grace cried the first time she read it. Caleb had to excuse himself to the porch to steady his breathing. By spring, Sophie's book was finished, hand-bound in ribbon, and titled in crayon, "The Girl Who Found Her Father." Grace sent a copy to a small local publisher, and within weeks it spread like wildfire. Parents, teachers, and children across the country clung to its quiet strength. It wasn't just a story, it was a mirror. And in every page, every tender sketch, Sophie reclaimed the narrative that once hurt her and turned it into something whole, something luminous, something that would help others find their way home. It was Sophie's idea, as most of the best things in their life seem to be. One sunny afternoon, while Caleb fixed the front steps and Grace tended to the small herb garden she'd planted by the porch, Sophie disappeared into the garage with a scrap of wood, a handful of paintbrushes, and that particular determination she always wore when something mattered deeply to her. Hours later, with streaks of blue and green on her cheeks and paint on her overalls, she called them outside. The wooden sign she held was imperfect letters, uneven colors, slightly mismatched, but it radiated something truer than any polished plaque ever could. She had painted 3 figures, one tall one with long hair, one small with outstretched arms, all standing beneath a crooked little roof with a heart in the middle. Beneath the drawing, in thick, careful handwriting, she had written, "The Morgan Home, where there are 3 people and 1 second chance." Caleb felt something tighten in his chest, the kind of feeling that words rarely captured, a blend of pride, ache, and overwhelming gratitude. Grace knelt beside Sophie, brushing a strand of hair from her face and whispering, "It's perfect." They hung the sign right by the front gate, just below the mailbox, where the morning sun could catch the shimmer of the paint, and neighbors could see it as they passed by. Strangers slowed down when they walked past the little house on the hill, pausing not because of the name Morgan once known in headlines, but because of what followed it, a declaration of healing. It wasn't just a nameplate. It was a story, a testament, a promise carved in wood and sealed with paint. That sign became a landmark in the town, a quiet symbol that no matter how broken a past might be, love could still rebuild it into something whole. And every time Caleb walked through the gate, he touched the edge of the sign like a ritual, reminding himself, this isn't a mansion, it's a miracle. And it started with 3 people and 1 second chance. In the end, Caleb, Grace, and Sophie's story wasn't about perfection. It was about presence, about showing up when it matters most, even if you're late. It teaches us something deeply human, that people don't need you to be flawless. They need you to be there, to listen, to admit when you were wrong, to choose love not just once, but again and again, especially when it's hard. We live in a world that celebrates success, titles, wealth, reputation, but too often forgets the quiet victories, the courage to apologize, the strength to stay, the humility to start over. Caleb had everything, and still felt empty until he faced the truth he'd been running from, and built something real from the rubble of his mistakes. Grace reminds us of the quiet power of resilience. And Sophie, the little girl with paint on her hands and love in her heart, reminds us that healing is possible when people are brave enough to care. So if you're carrying regret, if you've hurt someone or feel too far gone, remember this: it's never too late to make things right. You don't need a perfect past to build a beautiful future. You just need to start small, show up, stay. That's how love is rebuilt, brick by brick, moment by moment. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. Maybe there's someone you need to forgive, or a second chance you're still waiting to take. Save this video if it made you think differently about family, and don't forget to follow our channel for more stories like this, stories that remind us what really matters. Because sometimes the most powerful story is the one that teaches us how to begin again.